Welcome to Rule the World, the art and power of storytelling. Storytelling is what connects us as humans, and for brands, it is no different. A well-told story can effectively position your brand in the minds and hearts of your audience, and can convert thoughts and feelings into results and revenue. On this show, we dive into the unique and recurring principles of world-class storytellers from every walk of life, to help you level up your storytelling skills and knowledge to drive real, measurable results for you and your organisation. Here's your host, Paul Furlong.
Well, hello and welcome to Rule the World, the art and power of storytelling. I'm Paul Furlong, Creative Director of Opus Media, and today's guest is Jack Lynch, the pre-eminent scealiai or Irish storyteller. Jack is the chair of Storytellers of Ireland and a founder member of the Dublin Yarnspinners. He spends his time telling stories at festivals around the world and is an expert in folk tales, myths, legends and tall tales. So hi Jack, welcome to the show.
Thanks, good to be here.
So let's start, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you spend your time.
Well, basically I'm a full-time storyteller. I was originally an actor. I still am as an actor, but haven't been working that often as an actor, but I still do, like radio plays and odd bits, television, film and all that. It's a while since I toured with a company, so I miss that camaraderie. But the thing about being a storyteller is that, I'm my own boss, I deal with my own material. Storytelling and acting, they're quite different in some very specific ways. For example, here's a definition. A friend of mine, a Danish woman, put it like this. She said, the actor gets the story from the text of the play script and that. So the actor gets the story from the words. The storyteller gets the words from the story. So to explain that, none of the stories I tell are written down. Sometimes I'll source them from written collections and that. But when I'm telling stories, I'm not reading from a script in my mind, I know what happens in the story. I know that up ahead we're coming to a bridge and then we're going to turn into the woods on the left. So each time I tell the story, it's coming out differently, Some stories I've been telling for a long time, the phraseology might be similar in that. But for example, if I'm telling in Germany, say, or in the Middle East, to people who don't have English as a first language, I'm judging how much they're understanding me, so I'm editing in my mind or I'm rephrasing things in my mind without breaking the flow of the story. Because basically storytelling, in my case as a traditional or professional storyteller, it's a conversation. It's very interactive, So another difference in theatre is that, if I am telling stories, say, in the break of a music concert, whether it's traditional music or jazz or whatever, I sometimes forget to tell the lighting person that when I come on, I need the house lights up a fair bit because I need to see faces, I need to see eyes, I need to see reactions. I'm sort of listening to people's eyes in a way, and that is affecting how I tell, the way I phrase what I'm saying, and that they're getting the story. So yeah, I have been storytelling, I suppose, for the last I don't know, it probably 18 or 19 years. I came to it through acting. A lot of people come from other sources, librarians, teachers and that, come into storytelling. So I suppose storytelling in relation to the theatre world, it's closer to Shakespeare or Brecht, you know what I mean, where the actors had direct contact with the audience in the theatre, and it was conversational to a degree, do you know what I mean? It was direct address, let's put it like that.
Rather than kind of the Stanislavski school of thought where you...
Certainly rather than that. I mean, I did at one stage have a job of writing the scripts for a ghost bus tour of Dublin. It's still on the go. I'm sure it's quite changed, but so there were two actors who were going to take on the job. One would do it for several nights of the week on a bus moving around Dublin. The stories were very site specific, But then the bus drivers, these would have been tour guides who are natural storytellers. They got interested as well. Now, it turned out the two actors were from the local Stanislavski studio, and they found it very hard, without having the fourth wall, they found it hard to directly address the people on the bus, you know. On the other hand, some of the scripts I wrote very precisely, you know, they were based on, like, say, stories by Sheridan Le Fanu, one of the many Dublin Gothic writers, Bram Stoker and, you know, Yeats Wilde and the rest of it. But to tell a good ghost story, it's a very difficult thing. So in relation to some places where the bus would stop, they needed to be sort of told verbatim, the way they were written, because, you know, for example, in Le Fanu, the tone is, now I'm a scientific man and maybe you're a rational person too, and I'm going to explain a series of occurrences. You may find it believable or not. And then he talking in that term, and then by the end of the story, you're quaking in your boots, you know. But the bus drivers, they couldn't learn a script, you know, so that was the problem. Now, the actors got around their Stano problem by creating big Dickensian characters, and then they had that mask they could talk directly to the people with, you know.
Very good. So, in the introduction, I introduced you as a scealiai rather than a sceaniai. Can you give us the definitions of scealiai and sceaniai, please?
Sure. Well, sceaniai is probably the best, a word that suggests the traditional storyteller. And sceaniai means a tradition bearer. Seanchas means ancient wisdom, and it's oral wisdom. Now, the position of the sceaniai was a traditional one in entertainment in Ireland, where people would gather together in neighbours' houses, in a neighbour's house by the fire. The sceaniai would be there, and the lore that he had wasn't just stories, you know, ancient or more recent folklore, folk tales. He would know about folklore. He would know about you know, the genealogy of the people in the area. He'd know about the meaning of the place name, which would be very important. Place names, of course, were anglicised from the 1820s on by the British Army engineers who were making the first full map of Ireland. So while each turn of the road and each corner of a field and each bridge over a river had an Irish name, and there was a story behind that name, once the names became anglicised, the story fades further back into the past. But I suppose I do think the sceaniai and that tradition of storytelling is very much related to place. I'm very aware of that. It's related to community. But this storytelling tradition in the local houses, they were called Céilí houses in the north and in Scotland. Rambling houses or story houses, and they're still on the go. There's been a revival around Ireland, because, you know, television, well, what's the Bruce Springsteen line, 60 channels and nothing to watch, you know. So yeah, related to community in that way. Of course, when you're telling stories to any audience, you're making a community of them, you know. So yeah, the scealiai means storyteller, and that was one of the talents of the sceaniai. But I am aware that the sceaniai is it's an older form of local lore and received tradition that in the 20th century has sort of dwindled, because while there was the storyteller by the fire, that man was replaced by the radio set, and then by the television set, and then by social media, you know. There are people around Ireland that I would classify as sceaniais, but they wouldn't be telling their stories in the way I do.
So, obviously, talking through scealiai, sceaniai, there's a huge storytelling tradition in Ireland, and the Irish are known the world over for being wonderful storytellers. Why do you think this is?
Well, there's a $64 question. I think Ireland is, I don't know, there is scientific discussion on whether there is a storytelling gene, you know, and probably storytelling is the oldest art form. The people who arrive back in the cave, and they sit by the fire. They'll tell stories of the saber-toothed tiger that got away, and the next night it'll be a bigger one that got away, Ireland, and this is a sort of a sideline to your question, Ireland is in a unique position in that the Irish language itself was basically outlawed over the centuries, into the 19th century. So, and this happens in most colonial situations. So, we had to take up the English language. So our attitude to the English language is quite playful on that, hence you get comic Irish writers like going back to Sheridan and Congreve and that, and then up through Jonathan Swift and into modern days, Beckett, Joyce. So we have a playful way with language. And as for why we tell story, I don't know. We're just a sociable, garrulous lot, and maybe because of maybe historically, the bard, would have been an early version of the Shanachie. The bard would have been a harper, but would tell stories, and a bard would have to study for 12 years, and was usually employed by a local chieftain, and would be recording or be telling stories that bolstered the reputation of the chieftain, or told stories that could crush somebody, because they were derogatory stories and that. So I'm sure there are other cultures. I mean, storytelling is just so basic to human nature and that, and even in terms of sitting by the fireside telling, that fire could be in an oasis, it could be outside a Native American lodge, it could be in the jungle. Stories are a way that we make meaning of the world, of life, and of bigger questions like death and the notion of a soul and that. So I think basically storytelling is about wisdom, and there's a lot of concern, I think, amongst storytellers recently about how do we make new traditions, how do we get stories that will relate to the world as it is. So, and then we use stories like, if you take like the Northern European tradition, Grimm's tales and all that, they're read, or they're told or read to kids at night. They're warning stories like, don't go into the woods on your own, or that, and they can be frightening, and that's a good thing, that frightening thing. So I think stories are very good for young people, because they have problems that are resolved, and they're heroes and heroines, and they relate to basic things that kids are going to have to deal with. Just talking there as an aside with my daughter-in-law, we're talking about teaching her little daughter, my lovely granddaughter, about chess and that. A friend of mine was doing a film documentary of prisoners in Mountjoy Jail in Dublin learning how to play chess, and then at some point some local school kids, secondary school kids, 13, 14, were brought in to play opposite the prisoners. And there's some very funny scenes where you get this prisoner saying, oh, this kid's doing me head in, he's after taking me queen, and he's only bleeding 14, But the point of the documentary, as explained by the teachers in the prison, was that chess, for example, is about choices. You make choices, and you have to think ahead of how your choices are going to affect what's going to happen, and that's not a natural way of thinking for young kids that grow up and fall into crime. It's a matter of choices and looking ahead and all that. And I think that so almost parallels, what kids are getting from stories, their wisdom. There's a kind of wisdom there. I mean, I've been telling stories. A friend, Richard Hamilton, who worked as a BBC World Service guy in Marrakesh for 5 years, finally decided he's going to collect the stories, have them translated. He saw it as the end of a tradition. I don't think he was right in that. But some of those stories I tell now to, new Irish refugee communities here, and and they're parallel to Irish stories, where a tyrant gets his comeuppance, or whether the wise fool, the Jack character, or the Hans, or clever Hans, or a Nancy in the African and West Indian tradition, or Coyote in the Native American tradition. Lots of those stories are about, they're coming from an underclass, or a peasant class, and they're about the boy who sees the king has no clothes, and they're in that tradition, and they crop up all over the world. In the Irish tradition, in the Gaelic language, we have about 500 versions of the Cinderella tale in Connemara alone. And unbeknownst to the Americans, there are about 100 leprechaun stories in the whole of the Irish tradition. It's not a featured thing. It's probably imported from Europe, trolls and that. But Mr. Walt Disney, when he made his Darby O'Gill and the Little People, gave the Irish Americans, who are a race apart, and fair play to them, this notion that Ireland was full of leprechauns and that,
So what elements do you think a good story should have, or what elements should be parts of all great stories?
Well, generally, to pare it down, a story has a beginning, and a middle, and an end, and the middle is usually some problem that has to be resolved by the end. The hero or the heroine is put through various trials, and they have to, by their own innate wisdom or by luck, whatever, they overcome these trials, and at the end they kill the Gorgon, or they get the hand of the princess, or if it's a woman, she gets to be at least able to refuse this dim, handsome prince's hand.
Well, I wonder what you do when you're preparing to tell your stories, because you say you don't read them from being written down. It's in your head. Is there any preparation that you do for it? Or?
Oh yes.
Yeah. So what does that look like?
Well, the stories would be sourced. Either I hear them from somebody else and I ask permission to use them. I'll be talking about older Irish tellers that I was lucky enough to work with, and that. There are many collections of Irish tales that have been published over the years apart from the manuscripts and that, which are, in museums or libraries and that, and they're in, old Middle Irish Gaelic and that, so I might take a folk tale that would be quite common, but somebody's version of it might appeal to me. I would ask them for their permission to work on that. So I would tell maybe that version of it, but it would develop as I tell it over the years. I might underline some things. I might feel a warmth towards the main character. Maybe he's a shy guy who falls in love with some woman who turns out to be a go-between for the fairies. And so I'll develop my and the audience's sympathy for this guy, So basically, in those cases, I am using traditional tales. Like, we're talking now about folk tales, which are in the tradition over, 300 or 400 years, or maybe beyond that. The older tales, the epics and the romances and the myths and that, of which we have a huge body of. I think it's only bettered by the Finnish archive. Those are ones that I choose them, particular ones, because they appeal to me in a certain way. It's like if you go through a joke book, you might find one or two jokes that really tickle you. But with these older stories, the themes might be to do with just things that are important to me, like and it'd be only years maybe later that I realised, subconsciously I picked that story because it's about revenge and the necessity to give up on revenge, if things are to go forward. So I do have another large repertoire of stories that I've put together myself. They're tall tales, and they're often based on funny incidents, sometimes on joke stories. And I tell those in a sort of a local dialect, a sort of a Cavan accent. Cavan's where my father was from. I like the music of the accent. So I have now, like, I have several hours of these interlinked stories, and there's a dramatis personae of all the characters that come in and out of the stories, and including doctors and farmers, barmen, including cats and dogs, that have an important part in a particular story. So, I will sort of structure a story. I'm talking about these ones that are self-generated. They'll be based maybe on something humorous that appeals to me, and I think, well, that would fit into those stories, So I'll try them out. I usually record myself telling, and so new stuff that comes up, I don't forget, and so the stories develop, and they take on their own flavor as they mature, and some of them are interlinked, and they're basically about human foibles, I suppose, and chancers, guys that. One particular guy who is just totally he's a keen polluter. That's one of his hobbies, and that's a bit shocking to some American audiences, that you can have a hero of some total ne'er-do-well, but he usually hoodwinks authority, often the authority being the church, and that was an important thing in these traditional folk tales, where the authority figures were taken down a peg,
When you're delivering the stories,
Yeah.
do you have elements of dialogue in it? Do you have elements of you've talked about humour,
Yeah.
and obviously you've talked about the beginning, the middle, the end of the story.
Yeah.
So how do you weave all of those elements together? It's kind of more of a story than a kind of a and then.
Well, I suppose maybe to take it back to somebody telling a joke or a story joke, or something they claimed happened to them, and we do that all the time. There's a certain tone that you come out with, There's a sort of a winking thing, a sly understanding that you've gotten the audience on your wavelength, and you just put in as many humorous details that build up a picture. In a sense, it's like any kind of writing, although it ends up not as writing. It ends up as a spoken word thing, but it would be close to, I suppose, playwriting in that, or playwriting for a single voice. And then I will, I throw in bits of dialogue, but the listeners probably don't see them as dialogue. If you were telling a story about a funny thing that happened to you, well, I went into the supermarket, and this woman came up and she says, do you know where they keep the socks or something like that? And then you quote speech, and that's not I'm not giving you that as an example of a story. There are some stories up on my website. There's an example of a traditional story collected in Irish in the 1940s from an old woman. But this particular story we know is a universal tale. It's called The Soul as a Butterfly. And it deals with the notion of a soul or this world or another world. And we know the first recorded version of it was written down in one of the French principalities, Merengovia or something like that, in 787. So because and it's got a central image of a butterfly, which is a very potent symbol, I think, for most cultures. Maybe not the Eskimos. I think butterflies are a bit shy up there, but the butterfly, it's a notion of transformation. The caterpillar turning into a butterfly, and the fact that lots of people have stories about butterflies appearing after the death of someone, you know. So the soul as a butterfly, it's what it's called. I was selling it recently, well, 2 summers ago in Greece, and I had been thinking about, you know, the Greek word for soul is psyche, and we get all these psychology, psychiatry, psychotic and psychic and all that. And then I found out to my delight that while the Greek word for soul is psyche, the Greek word for a butterfly is psyche as well, you know. So these symbols are very deep-rooted in the human imagination, and hence they travel.
I think that brings us on quite nicely to the next question I have for you, which comes back to what we were talking about towards the beginning with the kind of the Brechtian and the Stanislavski kind of acting, where Brecht really engages with the audience and Stanislavski kind of doesn't so much. And there's something that's written on your website that says that for stories to live, they need the hearts, minds and ears of listeners. Without the listener, there is no story. So can you explain that a little bit and how that influences your storytelling?
I'm not sure who that quote is from, but it's basically, you pick up, if I pick up Othello, Shakespeare's Othello, do you know what I mean? That's not in the paperback, do you know what I mean? It is there, but it only happens in front of an audience. It's a thing that's happening between the audience and the actors, you know. So, well, the stories are for the telling, and if you don't have an audience, the story doesn't become alive in the air, you know. You can tell it to yourself, and you know, if I'm preparing a story, I'm driving somewhere, I'm telling the story to myself. But it's only when you're in front of an audience and you see their immediate reaction, and that's what you build on, you know, whether it's a reaction of understanding or miscomprehension, you know, because maybe of language or something like that. That gives the dynamo to your way of telling, you know. It's like on stage with actors, you know. You're playing opposite somebody, you know, you're working from a script, you've been directed, you have marks you have to reach, and so you'll be in the light, and so there's one half of your brain inside the character, and then there's another half of your brain responding truthfully to the other character opposite you on the stage. And then, as I sometimes say, and the third part of your brain, the third half of your brain is very aware of the audience, you know. The timing of the actors on stage depends on the reception the audience are giving, you know. So there's a dynamic there between telling, listening, and I think the first thing a storyteller needs to be is to be a listener, you know, ironically. And so the story is part of this new relationship between the person telling and the people listening.
So what is it that you're listening for or watching for when you're telling your stories to the audience?
You want to know that people are with you. You want to know that they're understanding, that the story is there. You know that they may be aware that you're coming to the end of a story. So there are various signals that are going out in the writing or in the telling that you're basically, as I said before, it's as if you're bringing them on a journey, you know. You're a guide, you're a tour guide. And the journey is the story. You know the events, and you're unfolding those events anew every time verbally. And how you do it is totally dependent on the quality of the listening, you know, and what you've won, you know, that they're following you, they're with you, they're laughing when you want them to laugh, or you know, they're taken up short when something that comes out in the story that's very surprisingly moving or something like that. There's a story I tell I got from a great old storyteller. He would have been known as a Shanachie, Eamon Kelly, but basically he was an actor. He said he was an actor playing the role of a Shanachie. He, you know, I'd seen him in Chekhov and Ibsen and Shakespeare and the Irish greats sing in that. But he started doing plays or one-man shows based on the stories that he had collected, and he had been using on the radio as a radio shanachie. And so he has one story about a guy who goes to America and comes back after 6 months, but still has a world of stories he can tell to the neighbours every night in the cottage, much to the annoyance of his brother and his sister-in-law, because she's house proud and all the neighbours are trooping in. But at one point, to illustrate the marvels of the New World and New York in particular, and skyscrapers and that, people want to know where their relations are living in New York, So he says, nothing for it, I have to draw a map. There's no piece of paper big enough in the house, so he takes a coating of ashes from the fire and spreads them out, gets people to move their chairs back, takes up a cane and begins to draw in the ashes the outline of the island of Manhattan, 10 miles wide and long and 3 miles wide. And then he's drawing the avenues that crisscrossed it and sold by the Red Indians to the Dutch for less than $50. Don't you think there were some bargains going in those days? And then there's a point in the story where he begins to point out the neighborhoods on the island of Manhattan. And I found something in this story that isn't in Eamon's telling of it, because there are recordings and videos of him telling it. But at this point, he begins to point out the neighborhoods on the island of Manhattan, and those neighborhoods were familiar to us as the townlands of our own parish, the Bowery and Chinatown, Hell's Kitchen, all that. But I'm telling it on one occasion where I knew the audience were very much aware. It may have been in Newfoundland or somewhere, where they were very aware of emigration and all that. I suddenly realized the import and the heartbreak of that thing, Those places that he pointed out were as familiar to us as the townlands of our own parish. People knew about the Bronx and Chinatown and all that, and I just suddenly, on this occasion of telling it, the hair stood up on my head, because I knew this was a sort of after the comedy, it was a slap in the face. It was totally sad. There was a tristesse and a truth in it, and so my timing for that usually takes that into account. Now, it's only happened twice before in that way, where I've actually felt that the audience were a bit shocked, by the the sadness of this notion, Happened to me recently, telling it in a man, but you can't predict when you're going to feel moved, by something like that, So the stories change in the telling. You'll get a reaction for certain lines. You keep that in mind.
So, sticking with the theme of the audience, when you're in the middle of telling a story to the audience, often the stories can be quite long, sometimes they can be quite short.
Sure.
What tactics or techniques do you use to keep the audience engaged throughout the whole of the story?
Well, I suppose because I've chosen a particular story and because it appeals to me in a certain way, I think it's a story that I could tell. It's a good story for telling. I've identified my main reason for telling that story, the main thing in the story that appeals to me. So I'm not just telling any old story. I'm telling a story that I want to give them, that I think they might appreciate. And then how to keep them engaged? Well, I suppose that's some instinctual thing. It may come from my experience as a storyteller and, to a degree, my acting experience too. Although, as I say, they're both quite different. There's another thing about it, when you're rehearsing a play and you're improvising on a character, the director will often say, no, don't tell me, show me, so, if you're improvising and a character's going through a certain thing, it's the way they look towards the door or the way they light a cigarette gives you a notion of what they're thinking or how they're feeling. So the director says, no, don't tell me, show me. In acting, I came up with the notion that in storytelling, it's more like, don't show me, tell me, just tell me, Now, I was disabused of that, because then I've worked with Indian tellers who do tell to music, and they show as well as telling, and that. So maybe I was a bit Eurocentric there, but I suppose how you keep an audience engaged, it depends on the richness of the story, and the richness of the story is how you were attracted to it, and you're trying to do justice to the story, and that you may not know exactly what the story is saying, because it's saying different things to different people, but a story itself is a sort of an engine, and it can give you, if you're experienced enough, it can give you a dynamo. It'll tell itself in a way. It's the story telling itself through you, if you've sort of honed your craft enough, and no matter how long the story is, that's the hope that you will keep them with you, and you usually do,
So, Jack, I am aware of time, so just a couple of quick fire questions, if that's okay with you.
Sure. Yeah.
So, who do you think maybe the greatest storyteller ever is, or who do you think of when you hear the words storyteller?
Oh, it's hard to say. Like, what's your favorite song? I mean, in Ireland, I think of people like Eamon Kelly, who I mentioned, who passed away in 2001. There was another man in the north of Ireland, John Campbell. I would have gone to the moon to hear John tell. He passed away in 2006. He worked a lot with Len Graham, the traditional singer, and when John got ill, it was very brief, serious illness, he said to Len, see if Jack will do some of the gigs that were booked. It would be like folk festivals in England, Scotland and that. So I did as many as I could, and I've been working with Len ever since. So it's a nice mix, the song and the story, because most traditional songs are story songs and that, I think of some of the great Scottish traveller tellers, Sheila Stewart and Duncan Williamson, Stanley Robertson. They've all passed, There's a brilliant younger Welsh teller, Daniel Morden. I think he's really superb. In America, a good friend of mine, W. Thomason, she's from the Sioux Apache tradition, and she is an extraordinary storyteller. And I see young tellers who are coming up, and they're really honing their craft, And then we have the literary tradition, looking back on storytellers, whether it's Shakespeare or Homer, Dante, Cervantes. That's just from a European perspective, But at the same time, I meet a guy on a bus, and he's a natural storyteller. Do you know what I mean? It's hard to pin it down,
Absolutely. So, are there any great books on the art of storytelling, or any blogs or websites that you can think of that you could recommend to us?
Well, there's one book that always springs to mind. It's by Walter Benjamin, great German thinker. It's called The Storyteller. That's the translation. It's 1935, I think, and that's very available on the web. It's a long essay. It's about a Russian writer, Leskov, but he uses that premise to talk about storytelling, and he goes very deeply into it. I mean, there's drinking and eating in that book, for the next 20 years for me, Berger, noted it. I think I first came across it when John Berger mentioned Benjamin when I was reading New Society articles in the 1970s. Also, there's a great American thinker on storytelling, Jack Zipes, Zipes. He has translated a lot of Grimm's and Arabian Nights tales, but he's a very clear thinker. He has a schools project, and he's basically coming from a Marxist background, so he would have very interesting critiques of Disney and the Disneyfication of young people's culture. Marina Warner, English writer, she's always very interesting on storytelling. But there are others that would be well known, like John Campbell and some well-known people. I wouldn't go all the way with them, but certainly John Berger has written brilliantly about storytelling in a number of books. Many of his books relate to storytelling. Well, there's one book, Ways of Looking, and there's an essay in the back of that about. He works a lot with Jean Moore, the UNESCO photographer, and sometimes the stories are just a sequence of photographs. And Berger, in that book, Ways of Looking, not Ways of Seeing, Ways of Looking, he's very interesting in that. But then lots of it. There's a recent 2007 book, Hold Everything Dear, and it's basically, the book relates to the Palestinian situation. But just in relation to traditional tales, and for example, the notion of a simple story like The King Who Has No Clothes, the boy is the only one, And of course, Berger is talking here in relation to, modern political situation. And he says, the powerful can't tell stories. Boasts are the opposite of stories. And any story, however mild, has to be fearless. The powerful today live nervously. Stories are one way of sharing the belief that justice is imminent, that justice is on the way. And for such a belief, children, women and men will fight at a given moment with astounding ferocity. This is why tyrants fear storytelling. All stories somehow refer to the story of their fall. So that would explain my own political approach to storytelling. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So I do think storytelling, it's about community, and community is about compassion and all that. And communities are being fragmented by history and economics and modernity and, mass media and the rest of it. But it does come back basically to telling a child a story to put them to sleep, I mean, I often work in elderly care homes. I remember being in one in America at one stage. It's with another Irish storyteller, and it was all these elderly people sitting there. And so I think I started the first story. So it was something like, long ago in Ireland, there was a king. And this king, as soon as I got that far, a woman in the front was snoring away, And by the end of my story, at the start of the session, everybody was asleep and snoring, And this nurse came up and said, "Oh, I'm so embarrassed, And I was saying, look, it's no insult to a storyteller, Those people felt safe enough to fall asleep. Maybe they're hearing the story in their sleep, but we tell stories to children to help them sleep, There's something soothing and healing about storytelling. Again, I've forgotten your question. I've gotten off on that track.
It's quite all right. I'll just ask you one more question then, Jack, which is, where can we find out more about you and where can we find you online?
Well, I have a website, which is www.jackstory.com. Jack Story, one word, lowercase. So, that has various things, about me, like a background and a few samples of hearing stories, telling stories, and then some bits of writing, some stuff about me, and then I have a section called Rambles, which is a long list of quotes relating to storytelling or life in general, some of them humorous, some not. There's another website, our website, Storytellers of Ireland, and we have a number of articles on that written by, from talks delivered to us, and there's a directory of storytellers, and there's various things. So that's www.storytellersofireland.org.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, Jack, I'd really like to thank you for your time today and for helping us to understand how to tell better stories, keep people engaged, and work with the audience. Thank you very much, and I'll speak to you again soon.
It's good to talk, yeah.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Rule the World. Be sure to rate, review and subscribe to the show, and visit weareopusmedia.com for more resources based on today's topic. as well as access to more episodes that will help you develop your storytelling abilities. That's weareopusmedia.com. Thank you, and see you next time.